Hi everybody, this is video number 3 in the series based on a blog about the feedback I give to teachers most often when I've had the opportunity to observe a lesson and then get involved in a discussion with them. The thing that I find is that sometimes, even though a lesson has been really engaging at the time or are full of ideas and knowledge and facts and skills that have been developed, students are left uncertain about exactly what they were meant to know, and then this knowledge isn't quite precisely defined enough for them to then revisit later. So what I suggest we're doing is making sure that when we teach, we specify the knowledge and we check that the students are clear about what it is they're meant to remember later. So, for example, we could have a fantastic discussion about something where there are lots of different possible ideas. So, for example, an environmental issue, like where we should put a wind farm and the impact a wind farm might have on an environment. And there are lots of details about that. You could study wind farms in various degrees of depth depending on the level of knowledge of the students or the particular point in the curriculum. Students would know about wind farms when they're in year 3 or in year 9 or in the 6th form. So the level of discussion could go all sorts of different ways in a class, but at the end of it we need to be clear. Right, so what are the main things that we all should know? And then let's list them out. The things that we, at this level, really should be clear about with wind farms are, and then we have some way of recording that we make sure all the students have got. If we're saying to the students, we watched a video or we use a textbook or we've had a discussion and we're saying, make some notes, well, that's a possibility. And if students have been trained to make good notes and you can rely on them doing that, you might find that they have done a decent job. But what I find very often is that the weakest students in the class make the worst notes, unsurprisingly. And if you look at their book, you'd think, well, if there was some kind of test on this later, I wouldn't want to have their book to revise from. But that's what they've got. So I think we need to be more clear. We need to be providing resources and things like knowledge organisers or walk through the process more deliberately and say, okay, so we've had this discussion, which is really important, that you've got some sense of the reason we're discussing wind farms. But the things I want you to remember, the things that you all must know are these 5 things, and let's be really clear. And then when you've spelt that out, you then check that people have got that. So you do the probing questioning thing again. We go back around the class. We say, okay, let's just check back. And we ask individual students, Mohammed, what do you think then are the 5 things? Let's just consolidate. What have we got? Yeah, do we understand them? So why is that one in there? And which one of those 5 might be the most important? And we're clear. We spell it out. And that takes a bit of time. So when you're get carried away with a great enthusiastic discussion, you've got to think, right, I mustn't just run into the end of the lesson and leave the class all leaving the room. I see this happens with, say, poetry. We've had an intense discussion about a poem. The students are getting to grips with it. We're teasing out ideas. We're exploring connotations and the use of language. And this is great. And we're thinking, yeah, this is really happening here. Well done, everyone. But then we have to go into that phase where we think, right, so from all of that rich discussion about this poem, if we're going to come back to this later, you're going to use it to compare to others. What are the main things? If you don't do that, what you're sort of doing is hoping that students will remember bits. You're hoping that this knowledge will have somehow sunk in. And we all know from the cognitive science and our own experience that just doesn't work that way. Some students will just forget a lot of what is shared in the moment because it's not clear enough what they're supposed to remember, and then they don't rehearse that knowledge and sort of consciously or subconsciously build links to other areas of their understanding. So we have to spell it out for them, the main points, and we run through it and we get them to practice. So for example, we could be discussing, say, if you're a teacher in year 4 and you're doing the Romans. To some extent, there's a kind of a broad knowledge base which just comes from encountering the Romans and some generic background understanding of that there were these people called the Romans and they lived a long time ago and they had some particular features of the way they ran society and they came to Britain. And you might hope that over time the students will have a general sense that when they hear references to the Romans, they'll remember that time. But don't we need to be a bit more precise than that? What about, don't we want the students to know some specific things about the Romans? Like, who Julius Caesar was, the fact that he invaded Britain and then, and maybe when that was. When did Julius Caesar live relative to, say, Jesus? And how long did the Roman Empire last in Britain? And when did that happen in relation to 1066? Now, these are facts which you can totally forget to teach, or you might air them at the time. They were kind of encountered. But if you want the students to remember those specific things, you have to be precise. You have to actually tell the students these are things that we're going to learn, and then engage in some form of retrieval practice so that they actually consolidate that knowledge. So you have to make a choice. Do I want the students to know that Julius Caesar invaded Britain in 55 BC or not? And if I want them all to know, then I need to make sure they all do, and I need to check that they have. If I want to know when we're talking about medicine through time in history GCSE, and we've got this fantastically interesting story about Jon Snow and how he plotted out the deaths around a part of London which was called Broad Street in 1854, and he made the connection between cholera, the disease, and the water. Now, again, they would have a general idea about this idea of disease as being linked to water. But if you want them to know it was Jon Snow, Broad Street, London, in 1854, and the detail, well, we need to be precise about that element of knowledge. So this is what I mean by specifying the knowledge and checking for understanding. And that applies to just topic after topic after topic. If you want your students to know the difference between an element, a mixture, and a compound, and you've asked them to make notes, that you might find, and I've seen this, that students over here have defined an element in one way, something to do with whether they can be broken down by chemical means or something, and the students over here have done it by saying elements are made of one type of atom. And that's unsatisfactory, isn't it? Because there are certain levels of understanding there which you're trying to be clear about. And if you want all of your students to be very clear, the thing you need to know about elements is they're all made up of a single type of atom. So iron is made of iron atoms. And water is made of 2 types of atoms, so it doesn't count as an element. These are specifics. They have to be spelt out, and they need to check that all the students know those types of terms, know those definitions in the form which they are going to be assessed in, and there's a clarity to it. I actually think quite often we should be giving students notes and recorded information and doing more checking that they understand it and can record it, rather than always piecing it together. And I don't think that's spoon feeding, because actually, if we're being rigorous about them knowing it, it's just more secure, especially for students who typically underachieve. So obviously, the note-taking needs to then follow on. So let's just try and be clear about this in our lessons. What exactly do we want the students to remember about this lesson next week and next month? Let's be really clear about that. Let's not leave it to chance. And let's be clear that when we say we all want them to know it, we literally mean all know all of it. And we engage in processes in the class to be as sure about that as we possibly can.